to those in a bit. But I do want to talk about this story because taxpayer funding for the royal family had tripled in real terms in the last 13 years. According to new figures from the House of Commons Library, the sovereign grant, the system for public funding for the monarchy, was introduced back in 2012 and it started at £31 million. But this year, it was £132 million. So what's behind the increase, and does it actually represent good value for money? Let's speak to Norman Baker, former Liberal Democrat MP and a member of the Privy Council, and Ben Lord, a royal commentator. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Ben, I'm going to start with you first. What is your reaction to these figures? Because on the surface, it just sounds like a lot of money.
It does sound like a lot of money on the surface, but I think there's a number of things to take into context, not least the fact that the royal family do pay tax. The monarch has volunteered to pay tax for over 30 years. So if we're talking about taxpayer-derived funding, they themselves are contributing to it. So it's not just coming out of the public and they are immune to the sources of taxation. But besides this, let's just not forget that the royal family, as a brand, creates enormous contributions and goodwill to British culture and indeed to the economy. An example of this is in the form of the coronation, which, although cost the public purse £72 million, it generated almost £340 million in one day for the economy. And equally, it's also been stated that upon his accession, the King committed to ensuring more financial prudence was shown in the royal family, evidence of which we did see with the coronation, with it being a very slimmed down affair in 2023 compared with that of Her late Majesty in 1953.
Yeah, I mean, a slimmed down ceremony, I guess, is of the time. I think that a lot of people would have looked at that and thought, okay, they can do this and do it within a budget that makes sense, considering where a lot of the country's finances are at the moment. And Norman, I know that you're here to discuss these figures also. What's your reaction?
Well, look, I mean, there's a whole lot of points Ben makes that I could pick up on. I mean, for example, the fact that the coronation, we're the only monarchy that now has a coronation, and nobody else bothers. The last coronation in Spain was 1474. And the cost of the coronation was probably more than 72 million, according to independent estimates. And also, the fact is, people had a day off work. I'm not begrudging them that, but that was a cost to the country from people not being working that day. So you can fix these figures any way you like. But the fact of the matter is that the cost of the monarchy in this country is way in excess, many times in excess of any other monarchy in Europe. As you see, it's multiplied 3 times at least, and that's a generous interpretation, because the civil list was 7.9 million in 2011, multiplied many times since then. This is 53% increase this year alone, 53% increase in the sovereign grant at a time when vintage fuel payments are being cut to pensioners, disabled people's having their benefits cut back, and council tax bills are going through the roof. You know, governments have got choices to make. And it's not true, by the way, Ben, to say they pay all their taxes. They don't. There was no inheritance tax paid on what the Queen left privately to Charles. Her £1 billion of jewellery, her racehorses, her artworks and everything else. No inheritance tax paid on that. The only person in the country not to pay inheritance tax. And there's no tax paid, corporation tax paid in Duchy of Cornwall when that's passed on to William. So they don't all pay their taxes.
Yeah, and if there are taxes that are not being applied to the royal family, then is there an argument to suggest then, Ben, that the sovereign grant, it should be capped at a certain figure? They're saying that actually the reason why it's gone up so much is because of the renovations of Buckingham Palace. But at what point do we stop? Or do you say actually continue because they actually bring great value for money to this country?
They do bring extremely good value for money to this country. You know, I've just cited one example with the coronation. You can go back over the duration of the sovereign grant to when the Prince and Princess of Wales got married and how much that did on that day in London in terms of the tourism that it generated. You know, the royal family is an extremely important brand in this country, not least for the cultural standpoint that it takes, but also what it creates in tourism. And we can't just ignore and overlook restrict that just because it suits those that would sooner see this country become a republic. So let's look at the advantages of why we have that. And yes, financial situations are tough. This isn't the royal family that's requesting all of this. The sovereign grant, the custodians of which is coming from whoever the sitting Prime Minister and the Chancellor are. So, if those who don't agree with this are dissatisfied with it, then really and truthfully, the criticisms are of the sitting government, not of the family themselves.
I mean, Norman, do you agree with that? It's 132
Well, I do partly agree with that. It's
perfectly
perfectly true that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, who are two of the three people who decide the sovereign grant, could actually rein this in, but they've chosen not to do so. But the palace also lobbied very heavily before 2011, and Charles did personally, for the sovereign grant to be created as it was, because what's now happened is that illogically it's now been linked to the publicly owned Crown Estate. You may as well link it to Tesco's profits. There's no other logical explanation as to why you link it to the Crown Estate, which is not a property of the King. And because it's been linked to the Crown Estates, that means that the Crown Estates as a property company has done extraordinarily well in the last 13 years. They've got all the seabeds where the wind farms are going up. And there's a windfall from the wind farms for the King, 12% this year. Now, why should the King get 12% of the money from the Crown Estate? And it doesn't make any sense to do that. So there's money coming in, which really which before 2011 would have gone to the Treasury, and it's now going to the royal family.
So where would you like to see that money go then, Norman?
Well, I mean, I think there needs to be a change to the arrangements for the royal family. I think they need to be back to a kind of civilist arrangement, which is controlled by the public purse. There ought to be more debates in Parliament. They've effectively been stopped when the sovereign grant came in. There should be National Audit Office control over the Duchy of Cornwall and Duchy of Lancaster, which there isn't, as in the same way as there over the sovereign grant money itself. And we need to have a slimmed-down monarchy. Now, Charles talked about a slimmed-down monarchy. We've got fewer people doing things, but there's not a slimmed-down bill. There's a massively increased bill. And as far as Buckingham Palace is concerned, here's a fact. £359 million for renovations. By the way, before 1952, the royal family paid for upkeep of Buckingham Palace. We now pay for it. But the money from the ticket sales, apparently, is private money, which the King takes. So we pay for the renovations, he keeps the ticket income money.
So when you hear things like that, Ben, there's a lot of money that is involved here with the royal family. You can hear Norman's argument about that money potentially going elsewhere. What's your argument then to suggest that actually that money needs to go to the royal family? You speak about the return on investment and how much they do for this country, but there'll be people listening and thinking, that is a lot of money. What are we seeing? What value are we seeing for that themselves?
But what we're seeing there is some manipulation of the facts. Yes, it is the case that the income from the royal estates does go to the monarch, but that he's paid income tax against. It was volunteered by Her late Majesty in 1992, following the Windsor Castle fire, that if there was an expectation that the government of the day was to pay for the restoration and repair works, Her Majesty at that point then agreed that she should be taxed, and that has been passed on to King Charles. So, and that's at the highest rate of income tax. That's not a token gesturous 20% rate, basic rate. That is at the highest level. So again, we are taking a view, if we listen to the other side of the argument here, that the royal family are immune to paying any forms of tax, and it is not quite accurately the case. They pay income tax on the royal visits to the royal estate. They pay VAT on all sorts of services that are provided when the public go into those estates. The properties that they own privately, they pay council tax on. So the list goes on, and I think we have to be really careful at balancing the facts and understanding the context and the definition of the different taxes that apply out there, which they are not immune to. And ultimately, then it could be argued that this sovereign grant coming from taxpayers' money, some of which has what's been generated by the royal family themselves.
OK, I'm going to read this statement out to both of you. In a statement, the palace said it's misleading to compare this year's figures with the earlier levels of grants. They say the big increase is due to the element of the grant that pays for Buckingham Palace, as we've established, the building works, I should say, rather than the core grant for other running costs. Now, the sovereign grant remained virtually flat for 5 years from 2020 during a high period of inflation. The majority of the increase in this year's sovereign grant, like we say, is because of Buckingham Palace and the resurfacing programme, which is ensuring that the palace is a national asset, is accessible and protected from fire and flood. That's come from a palace spokesperson. So I'm just going to give you the last word on this then, Norman. You've heard Ben really put his case forward that this is what's needed. this is the country where people associate royalty with. You know, clearly it brings in so much more than what we're letting out.
Well, look, I think the argument that they are good for tourism is the weakest argument for the royal family. Apart from anything else, the palace in Europe with the most visitors is the Palace of Versailles, and the French abolished their monarchy in 1848. So you could actually have tourism without the royal family. That's not an argument I'm making, but it's false to make an argument the other way, to say tourism is essential to keep the royal family there. And yes, they do pay some taxes, but they don't pay all taxes. They're immune from taxes that other people and other businesses pay. And as far as Buckingham Palace is concerned, the estimate in about 2013 was that £50 million would be enough for Buckingham Palace. Suddenly it became £359 million. And as I say, before 1952, the royal family picked up bill for maintaining the palace. And now they keep the money from the ticket sales. So, you know, let's be honest about this. The royal family is having a huge amount of public money it doesn't need. And for those who are monarchists out there, they can have the royal family, but let's have it at a decent price in the same way as we have other European monarchies. Our monarchy is at least 3 times more expensive, probably more than that, than any other European monarchy that's going.
Okay, well, Norman and Ben, thank you very much for your time. That's Norman Baker there, former Liberal Democrat MP and member of the Privy Council, and Ben Lord, a royal commentator. It is 8:50.